quickly. Was it practical?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Jacob Clemente. I'm Charter Senior Reporter covering AI and work.
I think
I'm very excited to be moderating this panel on how companies are navigating the messy middle of AI adoption, which, as Kevin said, is one of the main themes for today's summit. Joining me are two very special speakers. First, we have Iavor Bojinov, the associate professor at Harvard Business School and the co-lead of the AI and Data Science Operations Lab at Harvard Business School. Iavor has written a bunch of case studies on how companies are making AI work internally, from companies ranging from JPMorgan Chase to Moderna. And we have Katy George, who is the corporate vice president of workforce transformation at Microsoft. Before Microsoft, Katy was the chief people officer of McKinsey. And probably the most important line on your resume is that you were the co-chair of the Charter Workplace Summit in 2024. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
So to set a little context on this, I think, this past year we saw, I think, what we saw in 2024. People for 2025 were expecting to see a lot of impact on the business from AI, and I think that's not what we saw. As Nicole just said, productivity isn't everything, but just one stat to kind of set the stage for this. A recent survey from the Bank of England and the Atlanta Fed found that about 90% of CEOs and CFOs, when they asked what impact AI had on the productivity of their firm over the past 3 years, 90% said it had no impact. Yeah. So rather than focusing on that group of 90%, let's talk about the less than 10%, less than 10% of executives who say that it has had a positive impact. Katy, what do you think those companies are getting right?
Well, I think, as Nicole said, I agree with so much of what she said, actually everything that she said. AI is really a business transformation. It is not, and what we're finding, it is not a simple labor cost substitution. I think a lot of us went into this, myself included. There are McKinsey models, or Microsoft models that say, you take the job, you figure out the tasks that can be automated, you automate those, you restructure the job, the human job, and you drop the rest to the bottom line. What's actually happening, and as Kevin described, one of the things my team has just finished is 75 case studies of AI transformation inside Microsoft. And what we're seeing is actually the results are far more interesting than that. In that, yes, we are seeing productivity improvement, and that is often really fostered by being sure that a business leader is setting the focus and really establishing success metrics, bringing together process understanding and people understanding. This isn't just about the tech. I agree with Nicole. The tech is the easy part. The other pieces are harder, and knowledge work is super invisible and very tacit, so it's hard to actually even make it visible enough to action against. But what we're seeing is that in addition to those productivity savings, the kind of simple cost savings, what's far more interesting is that AI is bringing new capability into processes. So the way to measure the outcomes is typically not just a cost savings number, but is actually related to quality and value and growth and speed. So I'll give you just one very simple example from Microsoft. Our audit organization has really leaned forward into AI in a really exciting way. And they would say, yes, we can do an audit faster with less people than before. But what's far more valuable is that now when we finish an audit, it also comes with proactive risk identification. And that's just a very simple example. That's where the value is. It's AI adding capability in. And you actually need human beings to really take advantage of that capability. And so what we're seeing is that rather than, again, being kind of a simple labor cost savings, which is what people are looking for when they're looking for productivity, we're seeing it as a value creator that is a value creator because of the interaction between human beings who have expertise and understand what value looks like and AI.
Can you take us inside one other, you gave the example of audit, one other function or business area in Microsoft that you think has been particularly successful in applying AI and getting real results?
Yes, there are many. I'll give you our sales organization because I think they've done a really nice job of bringing together lots of different kinds of AI solutions. And they have a very simple metric. Then their metric, by the way, is not how many heads have they cut and what is their cost savings. It's revenue per sales rep. And the sales reps who are using AI the most have the highest revenue by far. And it's a very clear, not only correlation, but we're pretty clear it's causality. And so, for example, one of the things that our team did is they did ride-alongs with the reps. And they figured out what are the places where reps would really value AI intervention and augmentation. And they developed a version of Copilot, if you will, that's got best practice prompts in it and a whole set of data assembled for reps to use as they're preparing sales calls. And so now the sales call itself is far richer. And by the way, the reps can practice the sales call. And so it's another example where, yes, the sales rep is spending less time preparing what they used to do, but what's far more valuable is that there are all sorts of things that they didn't used to do that AI now brings to the table so that their preparation and their ability to engage customers is at a higher level. And that's just one of the many examples of what our sales force is doing.
Iavor, you've made this distinction between AI adoption and AI absorption and said that a lot of companies are tracking things like adoption, whereas absorption is a very different thing. Can you talk a little bit about the distinction between those two things and maybe give a picture of like one company you've worked with or done a case study on who's seen absorption versus adoption?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to differentiate those two things because adoption just means you're using it. And by the way, actually, most companies are still struggling with that because if you just go out and buy Copilot or ChatGPT and give it to your employees, they don't really know what to do with it. And they might use it, they may not, they might try out a few things, but that's not enough, right? You need to then give them guidance, you need to give them use cases, you need to allow them to experiment and allow them to actually learn how to use these tools. Then they can start to use these tools. And when you get to about 70, 80% adoption, then you can start to pivot into actually figuring out how can you use this to transform work. And that's the piece that you really want to focus on because just using this as a simple Q&A might give you a small productivity boost. Maybe it's not even measurable because with most knowledge workers, you don't actually measure their productivity, right? Like, what's the productivity of the average HR professional? You can try to squint at it, but it's actually really hard to quantify that. And so that's why I really focus on, first, you need to get that adoption. Of course, people need to be happy with the technology. They need to understand it, but then you need to help them figure out how they can really transform their work. And a concrete example is that we actually did write a case on Microsoft on their sales team and their sort of deployment of Copilot. And we saw this beautifully, which is they first sort of launched it, and there was this initial uptake in adoption. And it got to about something like 20, 25% daily active users, and then it kind of went down to 0 for a very short period of time. And then the question of why did it sort of go down massively was because people didn't know what to do with it. Once they figured out what to do with it, then adoption started and went up to like 70, 80%. And now this is the exciting thing, Katy, that you and your team are doing is you're actually starting to see how the job is starting to really be transformed. And you're starting to see that I think one of the numbers that was shared was in the past, the sales team was sort of spending like 70% of their time on administrative sort of heads down, not really interacting with customers. And now they're spending 70% of their time with customers. Right? And that's absorption because you're not just using it a little bit, you're actually completely transforming that role.
Can I build on that for a second? I was with some of our sales folks in Europe a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that was really interesting, it just talks about absorption versus adoption. They said, we used to pay a lot of attention to adoption statistics, how many times are people using it, who's using whatever. And now actually we just look at people's performance. Because we know that people who are highest performers are the ones using, and we know that the way to drive higher performance, everybody understands, is to use the tools. And I think the other thing that the sales example, but I see this over and over again in all parts of our organization, is this notion of moving from an individual adoption, individual productivity focus to team, persona, system, workflow. And that's difficult, and that requires real focus and effort that's different from just giving everybody a little prompt engineering training. But that's the difference, where you move everybody to best practice or in terms of prompts and agents, as opposed to hoping that people figure it out individually.
And it's really that shift from productivity to value. And I would argue with generic sort of generative AI tools like Copilot, productivity is not the right measure. Just in the same way of no one cares what's the productivity of Microsoft Outlook or what's the productivity gain of having bathrooms or Wi-Fi, right? Those are things, I know you sort of laugh, but it's exactly the same point. Like, 2 years ago, even now there's these debates, should my employees have access to AI tools? And I sort of refer to them to the arguments that people had in the past of, should my employees have laptops? Should my employees have internet browsers. Like in hindsight, those are stupid conversations because you are anchoring on the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think that's the first time I've heard ChatGPT compared to a bathroom.
But it will be, right? Like that's kind of how we're going to get to a point where it's so integrated into everything that you don't ask yourself, oh, is this something that AI can help me with? You just use it, just in the same way that if you need word processing, you go to a word processing Word, or you go to Google Docs. If you need slides, you go to a slide. Maybe now you might use Gamma.
Yeah.
You just use AI. You don't think about it.
You mentioned this kind of curve that you saw in the sales force at Microsoft, where at first everyone was like 25% of people were using it daily, and then it dropped to close to 0, and then it went back up.
Maybe it was like 10%.
Maybe it dropped to 10% and then went back up.
Yeah.
And the reason that it dropped is that people didn't know how to use it.
Yeah.
What was the difference? Like, how did people then get back up the curve? Was this the ride-alongs you were talking about?
Yeah, it's two things. One, we realized that, and this was before my time, so I'm not going to take credit, but the organization realized that we needed to actually connect AI solutions into workflow in a very explicit way. And so one of the things my team has done is to develop a playbook, 3 different ways to make sure that a business leader can identify where the workflows would benefit from AI and connect it in a way that really drives business performance, in a way that just giving everybody Copilot and prompt training doesn't do. And so that was one, literally you talk to the team, they're like, we realized we needed to go and understand the workflow, et cetera, to create the best practice tools and bring everybody. But then the second thing is we can't underestimate the importance of change management, right? What's really tricky is, I did a lot of work in manufacturing when I was at McKinsey, and there are lots of similarities between AI transformation and digital manufacturing or even lean in terms of transformation. But one thing that's different is that knowledge work is all about our individual behaviors. You can't just change the production line. You're not just changing a system in that people are all working in. And so you really have to actually have people come along for the ride. When we involve employees, first of all, they get the interventions right, the job redesign, the work redesign right, because they're the ones who really know it. But also really helping them understand what the benefit is and how to benefit. We actually just started in our Salesforce an approach where we've got huddles happening every week to make sure that the people are sharing with each other how they're leveraging tools. Because one of the things we're finding is this is not a once and done change management process, right? These tools are changing so fast that if you tried something 3 months ago and you didn't think it was worth it, you have to try it again, which means you constantly have to have experimentation and communication across the employee group to continue to develop best practices, but then to make sure that they scale to everybody, as opposed to just remaining kind of single points of light with individual employees.
Yeah. Katy, you mentioned that kind of persona-based approach, the ride-alongs, understanding what would be most useful for salespeople is one approach, and this kind of 3 different approaches that Microsoft has identified. What are the other 2 approaches?
So the first, which as you described, is the persona. Take a group of people who all do the same job and really understand what the best practice interventions are for them. It's pretty simple, honestly. We've done that in many different places across Microsoft. The second's more complex, but also more powerful, which is to take an end-to-end process, which means look at payroll end-to-end, look at Nicole mentioned several. And that's lots of people who come together, lots of different personas. You often have to get into data access rights and all of that kind of boring but really important work to enable AI. And we use value stream maps and Gemba walks and all those kinds of tools. And the trick is really to make sure that then you're being really creative, not just to automate the existing process with AI, but really reinvent it. And then the third recipe we call an AI incubator, AI first incubator. And that's really taking people who know what good looks like in a process and not anchoring them in the existing process, but really immersing them in the latest AI technologies and having them reinvent how they work with AI tools. What we're finding in that, and the reason we call it an incubator, is that teams can go and reinvent the way they work, but then you have to really incubate them from all the forces that will pull them back to the old way of working, whether that's their job description, incentive structure, whether it's the budgeting process, whether it's the interfaces that they have with other teams.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of something that's come out of this incubator, like a new way of working for a team or a specific type of role?
Yeah. I'll give you two examples quickly. One, because we've been talking about the sales force, there's a solution called Sales Agent that has actually closed business on its own autonomously. And I think of it as an AI first incubator because we actually directed it at white space. So it didn't go against kind of existing customers with existing relationships and existing processes. It was directed to white space, and it was an AI first solution there. And so that's one example. Another is most of our software engineering teams are doing some version of what I would describe as an AI first incubator. And we have one program that my team is helping to scale, which we call Camp Air, AI, and nobody knows what the R stands for, by the way, revolution, reset. But it was started, very grassroots in one of our engineering functions, and it's really caught hold because it works, which is you bring teams intact to an immersive boot camp. They spend about a week really learning and sharing between themselves about what's working and how to use AI most effectively. And then they redesign the way work happens. And they come in as designers and product managers and coders, and they come out as product builders. And they work differently together. And they start applying it in the boot camp to their actual jobs. And what's so unique is it's a great change management approach. People come in with anxiety. Believe it or not, even at Microsoft, engineers are nervous about what AI will do and whether they'll be successful. We talk a lot about changing your professional identity from being a great coder to being a product builder. And they come out real evangelists. But what's really unique about it is that it's the whole team that goes. It's not a learning program where each individual is doing something. It's the team learning together, changing the way they work together, and then applying it to their real-world work.
Iavor, you've talked about how AI projects have a very high failure rate compared to like your typical IT project. I think the number I've seen you cite is around 80% of AI projects fail. Why is the failure rate so high, and what are some of the best practices you see for companies keeping them on track?
That's a great question. So let me just come back to one of the things you said, which is under everything Microsoft is doing, there's a really important cultural element, which is, I think, what a lot of organizations get wrong is they just try to say, okay, we're going to do this, but they don't really think about the underlying culture of the organization. And so unless you have a culture that's open to experimentation, willing to try new things, is embracing this technology, is willing to talk about. There's so many companies where people are unwilling to even disclose that they're using AI, and they're worried that if it's seen as this is like an AI helped me do this, AI will get the credit, not me. And so there's this whole layer of culture that is underpinning this whole conversation that you need to think about how do you get that right. And this notion of change management is so important, but I'm starting to think about it as more sort of change athletes, because it's no longer, people compare this to digital transformations where you went from A to B. Now it's like A, B, C, and it changes all the time, and so you need to have this resilience. And then just coming back to this, what are the failure points? Well, one is you don't have the right culture. Two is maybe you haven't really put in the right systems in place of how to scale this up. Like a lot of times when people build pilots, they don't really think about end-to-end as you were thinking about it. They're just like, can I just build this like little pilot? But they don't think about can I even scale this? I think the analogy here is, right, if you want to get an elephant, you get a baby elephant and you let that grow, right? You don't get a squirrel and then hope you can feed it enough to turn it into an elephant. And so if you build a pilot, I know it's funny, but if you build a pilot that is not designed to scale, you'll never be able to get it into production. And so you need to go through this process and think end to end. And that's why I sort of think of this as you need sort of top down or middle down process redesign work with all of this bottom up innovation where you're allowing people to redesign their own work, the teams to redesign their own work, but you still have a centralized place. And by the way, the centralized team isn't just technologies, it's your CHRO, it's the operating officers, it's the CIO. They're all coming together because it's no longer just technology lives on its own, people live on their own. It's a whole integrated system.
And by the way, we've seen that 80% statistic before, right?
Yeah.
80% of business transformations, 80% of cultural transformations fail for exactly the same reasons you described. And AI has some special things that have to be true to make them successful, but some of the things are lessons we've learned in other contexts, but we didn't realize we had to apply it to AI and instead treat it like a tech project or a product launch.
So we unfortunately are out of time, but I want to ask one more quick question of you both. You're advising a company. The company has given everyone, access to either Copilot or ChatGPT Enterprise. People are using it for mainly email summaries, writing emails. In 2 sentences, what would be your first piece of advice for companies? Where do they start to move beyond this kind of individual experimentation?
You go first. I didn't think about it.
This is really why we designed the playbook and our recipes. So my first thing to start would be take the persona that matters most to the business performance you're trying to drive and make sure that you created Copilot prompts that will actually accrue to that business performance that you can scale to everyone, and then launch citizen developer teams to continue to improve on it and scale their ideas to everybody.
And create space for failure and experimentation.
Yes.
I think we're all we have so limited amount of time, and so if you're forced to do your regular job and at the same time experiment and learn all of these things, you're just not going to have the time. And we know every single time you try new technology, there's an initial dip in productivity. So make that okay. Create clear sort of vision of, okay, you're going to spend this much time on this, you're going to learn, and then you can actually start to apply all of the other learnings on top of that.
Iavor, Katy, thank you so much.
Thank you also.
Thank you.